There, as you mentioned, there are demos and documents in multiplayer sample for getting started on GameLift, but um, I guess maybe it's a bit much to start with a project that big. So I wanted to do something that was really just starting from the multiplayer template and to kind of dispel this idea of maybe there's some magic going on. It's really, I wanted to show just kind of the first steps of how you would get started. So by the end of this demo, what we'll have is an O3DE game server running in the cloud with a publicly available IP address that the game launcher, which you would run locally or you would give to your friends, can connect to. Um, what this will not be is a total implementation of something you would ship in the wild. So the primary reason for that is the game launcher won't have any way of requesting to create a new game server or even searching for existing servers to connect to like you would normally do, right? So that the game launcher at the end of this demo will be at the mercy of the developer to feed it an IP address directly. And we're going to create CVARs to do that. Okay, well, why would you want this? First, you could use the public IP address for testing your game in-house just for like latency. Like how does my game run on US West 2? And then the other thing is to give this IP address to testers or friends. It's a really good way. I think it might be actually the only way for doing multiplayer in early development with friends with O3DE since we don't have a NAT punch through system. So there's no way that, I could connect directly from my network to your network since our true IP is hidden behind we're all behind routers. So GameLift gives us that public IP address and some basic security. Um, three parts to this, and I think anyone who's doing this, I've done a lot of steps, behind the scenes. Anyone that's wanting to do this on their own or follow along is probably going to take around 2 hours. The coding itself is very short, in my opinion. It's, you might be coding for 5 to 10 minutes, but we're going to be exporting the server launcher, which is, requires a full build, release mode, monolithic build. That could take about an hour, but it's dependent on your machine. And then, yeah, whether or not you're using the installer or not. And then uploading the build to GameLift. When I tried it last night, I was a little surprised it took 47 minutes for just like a 250 megabyte server. Normally it's more on the order of like 15 minutes. I don't know, but so plan to spend time with this if you're following along after this demo I'm doing. And then the three main parts, right? So first thing is server launcher side. We need to tell GameLift when the server process is ready, right? We're going to give this build to GameLift and GameLift's going to start it, but it doesn't know when, it can't just say, oh, great, we're ready to host right away. No, we're going to put in some code into one of our system components to tell it, hey, I'm ready. And then we're going to, uh, well, this is where the logic diverges. In the process of doing this demo, I found some things that were not optimal. So if you're using 2409, you will need to also have the server listen for an event, the create session event, because that is when you'll want to load a level. If you're using the development branch, I've just updated it on a few days ago to you could do this all through assets. So you could tell it which level you want to load when you're requesting the game session. So that's the first thing, server launcher. Tell GameLift when it's ready. The next thing is GameLift side. So in the cloud through your AWS console, we're going to upload the server launcher, create a fleet, create a game session, and then create a player session. Player sessions used just to get an access key so that GameLift knows, hey, this person could probably be trusted. And then the third thing is the game launcher side. For that, we're actually not going to have any GameLift API calls. The only person making GameLift API calls is going to be the server launcher. On the game launcher side, we're just going to create some CVARs so that we could pass in the IP address and then that player session ID I mentioned for security. Just some background because it comes up a lot. Why not have API calls on the client side? And it's just AWS doesn't really recommend that. It's possible. There's the API exists for it. But three main things, sort of security, right? If you have direct GameLift SDK calls, that means you'd have to give your client access to do so. This gets a little scary. Um, Flexibility, so using a backend service. So the alternative, instead of letting your game clients do it, is to stand up a very, very tiny backend service that you run in a Lambda where your client can make RESTful calls to it. So it's just a little bit more flexible. If you wanted to change how matchmaking worked, well, now you have a backend service you could play with instead of having to reship game launcher code. And then scalability as well. So I guess you could handle multiple client requests, manage game sessions more efficiently if it's off sequestered in that standalone tiny server, that backend. All right. So I've already done this, but this game here, this GameLift demo, I'll open the editor. This is just what you get from scratch. Oh, failed to locate the editor. That's good. Interesting. Okay, maybe we will build it. Let's see what happens when we build it. This is just what we have from scratch, what you get with the multiplayer template. So hopefully, I don't think this should take too long because this has already been built. I was playing around yesterday, going back and forth between different builds. I wanted to use the nightly build, but it wasn't ready. So I'm building from source code. Although yeah, let me. Very surprised if this isn't already built. That is curious. Let's see. Oh yeah, editor's here. Should I can yeah, let's cancel it. Looks like it's still configuring. Let's just cancel that. Oh, work machines. Let me give myself admin access. Okay. So just before we get started, I just want to hit Control G in the editor so we know what to expect when we're running on a server. So default level, bunch of boxes. Gonna hit Control G. This is gonna load up our local server. Nothing to do with GameLift yet. And then yeah, so this is what we have. This is multiplayer template. Cool. All right. So now let's go back to that first step where we're actually going to change multiplayer template. And that is our server launcher. Let's open up Visual Studio. So this is the system component that the template just comes with. This is our project name, system component here. And the first thing we'll want to do is make sure that this component starts up after the GameLift component. Oh, that reminds me, one thing before then. I misspoke. This is not exactly multiplayer template. I did one thing to it. that one thing is enabling the AWS gem. So if you go to configure gems, search for GameLift or AWS, you see that's turned on. Cool. So back in here, so we turned on that gem, but we just want to make sure that the ordering of these things turning on, we want GameLift to be activated before we run our activation code, because we're going to do something in this activation code, which is tell GameLift, hey, we're ready to start hosting. So let's do that. Okay. So go required, push back, CCRC. And this service is called AWS Game Lift Server Service. And right now, this code would be ran for anyone who brings in this system component. So that would be the editor, the server launcher, the game launcher. We don't want it to run on those. We want it to only run on dedicated servers. So the way we get access to that is checking the AZ trait server and not AZ trait client. So these are macros that are defined, basically if you are a unified launcher or an editor, you could run as both the server or the client, meaning you can host a game but also have a player running around in the game. And that applies again to unified launcher.exe and editor.exe. If you are a headless server or a server launcher, then you will have AZ trait server defined, but you won't have AZ trait client defined. And then if you are just a game launcher and not a unified launcher, you will have, unified launcher will have it as well, but you will only have AZ trait client defined and not AZ trait server if you are just a game launcher. There's another point I want. Oh, yeah, if you've done multiplayer development for O3DE, you're probably already familiar with that, because as you're writing your multiplayer components, you sometimes just are wrapping your code in these. So shouldn't be too unusual to see. So, okay, great. So anyways, now this component will activate after the GameLift server service component is activated. Now, we are going to make API calls to GameLift server gem, not via scripting. So we will need to add a build dependency to our CMake. So let's do that now. So under our server, our static server module, let's add in the AWS GameLift server.static dependency there. Yeah, so build dependency private. That looks good. And that will make sure that will allow us so that we don't have any compiler errors when we make the next call, which is to include the header for the API call. So we're going to include requests AWS GameLift server request bus. And same thing, I'm just going to copy and paste. Make sure this is only running on dedicated servers. Actually, let's just make a comment there. Make sure code only builds in dedicated servers. And on activate, let's tell GameLift we're ready to rock. So same thing here. And we will uh, grab the bus call for that. AWS GameLift server request bus. And that's called notify GameLift process ready. Cool. Um, One other thing. So we don't always want to do this. I could imagine a situation where if you're just hitting Control G from the editor, a dedicated server still starts up, but we don't want, we're not trying to connect to GameLift just when we're testing locally for rapid iteration. So let us check to make sure that the GameLift enabled CVAR is turned on as well. So that CVAR already exists. It's used by the GameLift. It's used by the GameLift gem to know whether or not it should start working, and that's just called SV. I'll write it out here. It's SV underscore GameLift enabled. So we want to check for this, make sure it's true, and then only if it's true, then we could go ahead and tell GameLift that we're ready. So just going to grab the console so that we could look for the console variable. And say it's false by default. Get CVAR value for SV GameLift enabled. Store that in our Boolean. Enabled. And then only if GameLift enabled will we do this. Good, I'm seeing red here, but let's just compile this, see what happens. Built the headless server launcher. Or maybe better yet, let's cancel this. Let's just build the static module so we don't have to build everything. Let us build just the static server module for our project after we cancel that build. If it lets us cancel it. Now is also a great time to ask questions if you have any.
Given an overview of how GameLift connects servers and clients, just so people understand what is the role of GameLift in all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. GameLift really at this stage is just to provide a public IP address and a token. So um, you will have a O3DE server running in the cloud. That's AWS GameLift. And GameLift in exchange will say, here's a public IP address where people can access this server. And I'll also provide, GameLift is saying this, GameLift will provide a player session key. And when the client connects, so the client, anyone who's, if you've done multiplayer development in O3DE, you know that when you're connecting, you provide an IP address and a port number. There's one extra thing that goes along with GameLift is that player session ID, and we'll pass that player session ID in the connection message to the server. So the client will send, hey, I'm player ID XYZ, and then the O3D server will get that ID and go, hey, GameLift, did you just hand out this ID? Did you just create this ID? And there's even a time limit. So you have to connect within a minute, 60 seconds is all you get. And then GameLift will say, yeah, that looks right. And they go, cool. And then we'll let the player in. So does that answer that question?
Yep, sounds good.
Cool. All right, let's build, just making sure this compiles. I'm almost wondering if trying to build the editor earlier in Project Manager changed my configuration so much that it's recompiling anything or everything. I hope that's not the case. But
While we're waiting, could you briefly describe what net punch through is?
yeah, so there is a technique for getting around the fact that we, we are all behind routers. And so the IP address of my computer is not available to the outside world. And so what you can do is set up something where, and I haven't actually set this up before, but it's something I'm definitely interested in doing. But um, you could kind of set up a middleman somewhere where, once a middleman with a public IP address, because if I connect to that and you connect to that, now that middleman has our true IP address, and then the middleman passes each of the gives each of us our the true address for connection. So the fact that we're behind routers and that we have our IP, we don't have a publicly available IP address. Um, this is why we use NAT punch through, and O3D does not have this. All right, that succeeded. Um, cool. So that looks good. Let's, the next step is I'm not actually going to do this. Oh, did that answer the question about NAT punch through though? Why that needs to happen? Or why we need a publicly available IP address and the fact that we don't have NAT punch through GameLift becomes very useful.
Yep.
Cool. Um, so yeah, I'm not gonna, I'll show you how to do it, but not where we won't actually do it. And it might not even take that long because I've already created it. But um, before we ship to GameLift, we want to create a monolithic build. So just a pared down build in a separate build folder that just contains our server and no cruft. So just only the assets that are required. And we have a way of exporting now through Project Manager. And so yeah, just hit this hamburger menu. You could open the exporter settings. And so yeah, so I built in release mode and I built a game launcher, the headless server launcher, and monolithic. And then my output path is here. So this will land in the build export folder in my project. Oh, and also I changed this. By default, this is a zip. GameLift doesn't need a zip file. You could upload full complete folders to GameLift. So you could hit save on that and then come here and export for Windows. When you do that, after about an hour, you will get a folder that looks like this. So actually, it looks like less than this because you won't even have a user folder. User folder is like where logging goes and stuff like that. But we'll have just a really clean folder with the headless server exe in it. And what I like to do before uploading this to GameLift, like I mentioned earlier, just uploading it to GameLift took about 47 minutes. And we'd like to validate that this is working before then. So kind of a way to test locally is with something called GameLift Anywhere. And what that allows us to do, well, I think the intent is twofold. One thing it allows us to do is test locally. The other thing it allows people to do is, and that's not what we're doing today really, but if you wanted to host your own servers, like not use AWS, you could use GameLift Anywhere for doing that. But what we're going to do now is use GameLift Anywhere just to test locally. We'll host the server locally. So let us do that. I'm going to start up a headless server. And for this, I'm going to refer to the multiplayer sample documentation because there's a nice outline on how to do that. From multiplayer sample, that is located here in the multiplayer sample repo, MPS GameLift. There's a separate gem called MPS GameLift, and then a documentation folder and GameLift Markdown. And there is a section called GameLift Anywhere. Here we go. So test your local setup with GameLift Anywhere. And I've done a lot of this locally already, but let's just run through it. So the first step is we're going to create a location. I'll make mine US West 2. And this might bark at me saying, hey, you already have this location. Yeah, location with custom one already exists. And let's just so this is concretized here, let's go to the GameLift dashboard. I hope I'm not showing too much here, but custom locations. You see, I created a custom location called custom location 1, and then here it is in the GameLift console on AWS. Okay, next step is going to create a fleet with that custom location. Got to pass it in the region again. So we're going to create a GameLift fleet, name it GameLift Anywhere Fleet. The compute type is anywhere. You could have a compute type called something like managed. So we're using anywhere, not the AWS managed one. We'll see the compute type later for GameLift proper. And I don't know if this will bark at us. No, it didn't. Actually, okay, so I already had a anywhere fleet named anywhere, but it allowed us to create a new one. So we have a fleet here. And then I'm going to register my local machine as a compute. So this allows us, this is going to tell GameLift, hey, when someone asks to create a game session, or when someone asks for a game session, what IP address do we give it? And for us, we're going to pass the loop back. We're just going to pass ourself 127.0.0.1. Oops, don't want to copy that just yet. Let's copy this line. SOS2, compute, and then the fleet ID will be the fleet we just created. And next is creating an auth token. This is not something you do with GameLift proper, but GameLift anywhere you need it. So compute name is this. And we'll copy fleet ID again. Cool. What was that? Oh, must specify region. Okay, so we got our auth token now. And at this point, we can start up the headless server launcher, and we'll pass it in some CVARs to tell it, hey, start doing GameLifty stuff. Okay, so lots of CVARs going on here. So we want to start the not multiplayer sample, we want to start our GameLift demo, headless server launcher, GameLift demo, headless server launcher. We don't need a renderer. We don't need to connect to asset processor. This is also old school. For starting a level, we used to have to pass in a CFG, which only contained the words load level and then the level you wanted. That we don't need that anymore because we have a way of doing that now through game session creation, which you'll see in a second. We don't want to host on startup. So SV dedicated host on startup is false because, hey, we can't start hosting yet. We have to tell GameLift we're ready to host. GameLift then, when someone asks for us to start a session, says, now you start hosting. And the reason we don't host right away is because that create session that GameLift gives us might tell us things about how we should host or what level needs to be loaded or different properties. GameLift enable true, that should look familiar. That's the CVAR we checked for earlier in the code. GameLift anywhere enabled. And then WebSocket URL, that is coming from this. So when we registered the compute, it gave us a URL. We'll copy that into here. And that one doesn't change once you create it. So you could just keep using that one. The auth token, which we got from earlier, that one does change. That will expire every 15 minutes. So if you're running GameLift anywhere, and then at some point you can't connect, chances are you need to generate a new auth token. Fleet ID, let's grab it. A lot of copying and pasting. And then the compute name was, well, let's not leave it to chance. Let's just copy it to custom compute one. And then this process ID, you don't need. Just get rid of that. All right. Oh, what did we do wrong? Oh, let's make sure that is there. Okay, cool. So great. We see connecting to GameLift WebSocket server. That all looks hunky-dory. And then what we're going to do next is just ask us to create a game session. And then in the server logs, I'm going to bring up the server logs. Let's make sure that it loaded the level we expected it to load. So we want to see in the game logs that we are in dedicated server mode and that it loaded the level. So we'll come to here. So this command will actually, this command will actually go up to GameLift. Okay, let's see. Create game session. US West 2. And I was gonna say we would load up the level we wanted, but let's just see that it let's just see that it's running a dedicated server mode. I think that's enough for now. We'll save level properties for later. So let's run that. Cool. Here's our game session ID. And then let's go to the location of the headless server launcher and just look at the logs. So yeah, so that was in our package here, user log. First, just sanity check. Does this log look like it was built from right now? Yep, this is from 9:07 a.m. today. And just right away, you could already see, yeah, multiplayer operating a dedicated server mode. This would not have happened unless it received the request from GameLift to start a game session. So cool. I think we are ready to upload our server to an actual fleet now. The remaining instructions here are for like connecting the client and all that too. So again, a great resource is in these MPS GameLift documentation. Okay, let's build a GameLift proper setup. So in order to do that, first thing you do is upload the build. Now I've already done this, but let's just run through that just so you can see what that looks like. And this, I mean, yeah, we could stay in this doc here. So there should be a section called deploy to GameLift. There it is. And first step is to upload the build. Copy that. So S2, and we'll just pass it, not multiplayer sample. We'll call it GameLift demo. We'll just name it too, because I already have one on the server already. But we will do this just so you can see what that looks like. And we pass it in the entire folder where our package lives. So we're saying AWS GameLift upload build. The server SDK that we're currently running is 5.1.2 at this date, November 13th. We're running on Windows. And yeah, let's upload it. This doesn't take too long. So, it's 250 megabyte. Let's see how big our export is. Yeah, 217. Cool. So now we have a build ID. And if we go over to GameLift, we could look at the builds and we ought to see GameLift demo 2. And there's our build ID A0D, build A0D. So everything we're doing here is affecting GameLift. Then likewise, we could create fleet. Let's not actually do this because this is what takes a long time, but we could run through some of the parameters at least. So create fleet, US West 2 is what we want. And C5 large, that's the type of instance you'll use if you have, well, yeah, you'll want to test how much RAM you need and stuff, but C5 large is good enough for us. Fleet type on demand, you could do spot instancing if you want to save money and don't care that it's always readily available. Build ID, this would be the build ID that we just provided here. Runtime configuration, this will say if our game session isn't able to start within 5 minutes, something went, or 300 seconds, something went terribly wrong. And stop. This one here, server process, this is just something you need to know. This is the location of the executable you want to run. You're telling GameLift what to run. GameLift will put the folder that we gave it under C/games. So C/game, and then you pass in the executable that we provided. So that was GameLift demo, not server launcher. We made a headless server launcher exe. Parameters, we don't need a renderer. System pack priority 2, it's not necessary in release build. That's just saying use pack files, not a loose cache folder. So in here, you'll notice our cache folder is packaged up into these pack files. That's all that's saying. But again, not necessary if you're building release mode, because that's the default in release mode. There's a parameter here, terminate on player exit true. That means if there were some players that joined this server, when they all leave, shut down the server. Connect to asset processor 0, meaning we don't need a connect to asset processor. We've already processed all the assets. We haven't even given them asset processor, so it couldn't even if it wanted to. Here's that GameLift enabled true, dedicated host on startup false, like we mentioned before. Don't host right away. Let GameLift tell you when to host. And then this is something multiplayer sample implements that I would recommend implementing as well locally. We haven't done it here, but that is game session, no player shutdown time seconds, which is, and you can look at multiplayer sample what they're doing, but basically, if you requested a game session and no one actually joins it after 360 seconds or 3,600 seconds, then let's just shut it down because no one's going to join, right? Usually you ask to create a session and then someone joins. And then this last one, like I mentioned before, we don't need it anymore. If you're using development latest, we have a way of opening the server or the level you want. That console command was just there to load a particular level. And yeah, so if you were to run this, this is what takes a while to run. We're not going to run that. Instead, I will show you what that results in on GameLift. You will get a fleet that looks like this. And while this is being set up, you can look in the events column. If you're like me and you want to know exactly what's going on and why is it taking so long, you could come here and get some feedback. So you'll see fleet creation, building, installing, activation, and then server. Oh, this is a this is a weird thing. Sometimes I don't know if it's sometimes or always. GameLift will report the server crashed even if it shut down as expected. So like when all players leave and the server shuts down. So there's something there. I've actually have a GitHub issue out for that. We want everything to look nice and kosher, but sometimes it doesn't. But this is what we're looking for. This fleet state activate. That means we're ready to use this fleet and that there is cloud compute dedicated for your game. So with that, let's do what we need on the client side in order to connect to GameLift. And again, this won't include any GameLift API calls. We are just making CVARs so that we could kind of hard code hacky pass in a GameLift IP address and a port and a player session ID. Cool. So let's do that. And we're probably, I mean, are we way over on time?
We are 2 minutes over, yes.
Okay, let me copy paste stuff then instead of typing it out. So the first thing we will do for the client is just create these CVARs. So this ought to look familiar, but in reverse, we're only running this on dedicated clients. That means we're not running this logic in the editor. We're not running this logic in the unified launcher. We're not running this logic certainly on a server. Just want to run this on clients. And you'll notice what we're including here, there's nothing AWS or GameLift related. This is just the multiplayer gem session handler. And 3 CVARs, the GameLift IP address, the GameLift port, and the GameLift player session ID. And then on activate, we are going to use those CVARs to connect. So let's do that. Same thing here, only running this on the client. We're going to create a session config. Someone developing an O3DE who's doing a multiplayer game might have already done this when they're connecting. The only thing they might not have seen is this player session ID. And then we're just making the call to multiplayer saying request player join. And that is it. Let's build this and run it. Let's just make sure this compiles first. While that's compiling, let's start up a game session. Let's tell GameLift, start up an actual server now. So I refer back to the documentation again of multiplayer sample to do that. And that is, nope, that's GameLift. Here we go. So we're going to create a game session. So AWS GameLift, create a game session, region, US West 2. Fleet ID, where's our fleet? It is this here. Give this session a name, some player count, and this one is something you will not see. This is only in development latest, but we are going to provide the level we want our server to load. And that is going to be in the form of game properties. And the key is going to be level, and the value is going to be default level. That was the level. That's the name of the level, actually. Here, just show you that just to be super concrete here. Levels. This is the default level that the template ships with. So let's create that. Cool. We have a game session ID. If we come into GameLift, we ought to see the game session as well. Look at that. Perfect. So we have a server running with our game and the default level running. It's just waiting for us to connect to it. Awesome. And did that succeed? That did succeed. So I'm just going to run the game and we'll wrap up this demo here. We're going to run the game, provided the CVARs that we just created. So the IP address, host, and player session ID. So I'm just going to go into properties. You can run this from command line. I'm going to do this from here, but I don't want to connect to asset processor because I've already processed assets. And then the IP address of our server is provided here. So there is our IP address. And that looks like it has not changed from yesterday when I tried it. The port number, also like the same, 33450. Here is our port number, 33450. The thing that will change is our GameLift player session ID. This is the thing that once you spawn it, you got 60 seconds to get in there. It's the validation that our server is going to use that says, is this guy legit or is this some malicious person trying to get into our game server that isn't actually playing? Let's create a player session ID and run the game. Again, refer to the multiplayer sample documentation. Here is how you create a player session ID. So AWS GameLift, create player session ID, region US West 2, game session ID, this lovely large string here. Player session, let's pass that in to our command line arguments. And when we run it, we should expect to see what we ran from the editor, except now we'll be actually connecting to something in the cloud. There we go. So that concludes this demo here. For future improvements, this is a call to the community here, but would be great to see this in scripting. You'll notice some of the stuff we had to do, like using the pound defines of AZ Trait client and AZ Trait server, that's not exposed to scripting, but it could be. We're open source. We could easily add that. And then the other thing this is not including is any sort of matchmaking. We are hand feeding the client. What would be nice to see in a later demo would be, how does a client use the GameLift API to look for an existing game session and request for itself, hey, I'd like to play. Give me an IP address that I can connect to without having to spoon feed it. Thank you so much.